We are effective when we work together and when we do the right things. And if we restore the ecological systems on the planet, it will re-regulate the climate. If we don't, if we keep considering that materialism is the basis of our lives and that domination and inequality is possible and acceptable, then I think we're going to have to face the consequences of the mistakes we've made. So success to me is learning what this is and doing something about it.
Hello, I'm Herb Simmens, and I am the host of today's panel on adapting to accelerating climate disruption. This panel is sponsored by the International Society of Ecological Economics and the Climate Emergency Forum, climateemergencyforum.org. I am the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future and co-founder of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. And I'd like to introduce our two really extremely knowledgeable and experienced panelists today who will explore basically the different dimensions of adaptation. John Liu is a journalist, filmmaker, ecologist, and ecosystem ambassador for Common Land Foundation, whose work has helped to show that it is possible to restore natural ecological systems. He is the founder of the Ecosystem Restoration Camp movement that has, together with many partners, created not just one, not just two, but 56 ecosystem restoration camps throughout the world. He's produced, filmed, written, and directed dozens of films on environment and ecology that have aired on BBC, National Geographic, and other networks. Our second panelist is Paul Beckwith. Paul is a climate systems scientist who's taught at the University of Ottawa in the Laboratory for Paleoclimatology, as well as at Carleton University. He's a well-known climate educator on YouTube with, believe it or not, over 1,200 videos on climate science. So let me start by asking John to talk basically about what is adaptation, why is it so important, and what are the folks who are watching need to know about it? Thanks, John.
Let me just make one correction. We now have 80 ecosystem restoration communities around the world. So those camps have become communities, and there are 80. Adaptation and mitigation can also be seen as similar in some ways. But what we have is a massively degraded ecosystems. And when we have this, we have to do something to change the outcome, or it just deteriorates further. And what I've seen in my research and documentation is that the evolutionary succession leads to the soils growing in fertility and their ability to infiltrate and retain moisture, the vegetation to be fully covering the surface of the earth, and the height of the canopy to be increased where you can interrupt the solar radiation before it hits the surface of the earth, and the biodiversity massively increases. And when we lose this, we can actually restore it. And that restoration is more valuable than almost anything else you can do. So if we understand that by restoring the ecological function of these areas, we are mitigating and adapting to climate change. We're lowering the surface temperatures, increasing the ability to absorb and circulate moisture. And we're also engaging those people who have been hurt often in ways that they can really contribute to the goal, both locally and globally.
Thanks, John. Paul?
Yes, thank you. So, with the great increase in extreme weather events around the planet, it's becoming absolutely vital for people to be able to adapt to what is hitting us. We're all kind of living in what I call the climate casino, where no place is really immune to the effects of climate change. So I'll talk about some of the adaptation methods that are necessary in Canada, for example, where I'm from. So Canada experienced massive numbers of wildfires across the country last year. There was often fine particulate matter from the smoke and the ashes that were severely impacting people's health. So many different communities had to actually evacuate. There were some communities that burned down. So a big way to adapting to these wildfires is we need to, I like the Australian model where about 90% of people that fight fires in Australia are just everyday citizens who have had some training on how to fight fires, and they also have equipment which is in sheds and distributed across the country. So instead of just being evacuated when a wildfire is heading their way, they can actually do some clearing of vegetation around buildings. They can actually make sure things, structures, roofs are watered down, and prevent different structures from being burned in the first place, which seems to make more sense than just evacuating if you can do it in a safe manner. There's all kinds of different ways that we can adapt. I was just over at the Green Zone at COP here this morning, and for example, vast areas of Baku were once called the Black City because the land was severely degraded. There was oil flowing on the surface and a lot of industrial waste that had just when it stopped being used, it was just kind of left in place. So there was a plan over a number of years to turn the Black City into a white city, to have new infrastructure built, very energy efficient infrastructure, and also resilient infrastructure with the idea of having bigger drainage pipes, for example, to pull water away so that you don't get flooding when you get extreme rainfall events and things like that. So there's a lot of different actions that we can take, and it's absolutely vital to try to harden society, make it more resilient so that we can adapt to these increasing extreme weather events.
Thanks, Paul. I was also at the White City Pavilion, if you will. It's a remarkable three-dimensional model that covers quite a large area or so. And I would encourage, if you're in Baku, go take a look. And if you're not, to look it up online. I think it's a remarkable example of the kind of large-scale, thoughtful, at least appears to be, thoughtful, comprehensive, multi-dimensional effort, and also recognizing, of course, that adaptation is just as critical in suburban, rural, natural, and urban areas. All are affected by climate change. I wanted just to take a minute in preparation for this panel. I was wondering, what does COP say about adaptation? And I was surprised, and maybe I should have known this, maybe many of you watching know this, that wasn't until 2015 at the Paris COP when adaptation was mentioned, and apparently only in one sentence. And that sentence said, enhance the world's adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability. Certainly appropriate terms, but just the tiniest little bit. And I think, as many of us know, adaptation was feared for quite a while, as people were afraid that if we focused on adaptation, that meant we were essentially giving up on emission reductions. Now we recognize that we need to do both and other things as well. So basically, what are the challenges to adaptation? I guess I asked the question in the context in a book I wrote, A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. I coined the term, I don't know if I coined it, but I used the term readaptation. The fact that we're not moving towards a steady state future, but we're constantly changing as the climate changes. So if we adapt successfully, what that might mean in the short run, we may have to continuously adapt over time. Is that something, John, you give consideration to in all the projects you work on? Is the sort of dynamic nature of climate changes?
Well, I think maybe one of the most important things to look at is are we aware that there are different dimensions that we're primarily discussing here and in many parts of the world, and certainly in most policy and most corporate or financial considerations, we're talking about abiotic technical ideas. And even all this conversation about the carbon disequilibrium in the atmosphere or carbon trading, it's really abstractions. What we really need to look at is biotic systems, because on the Earth, we have an oxygenated atmosphere. We have fertile soils, which is a pedosphere on top of the lithosphere. And when we've destroyed the vegetation, when there's no life and death repeating itself generation after generation and accumulating the necromass, so you have the increases in biomass and you have the increases in necromass. If we don't understand this, we're not going to be able to adapt, because we're not going to make pipes bigger or smaller or hardened infrastructure anywhere that's going to photosynthesize, that's going to self-replicate and increase and create, has already created, constantly filtered and continuously renewed an oxygenated atmosphere, a fresh water system, fertile soils, and biodiversity. So when we're talking about adaptation, we have to know what it is that we're talking about.
Well put. And I would think it's fair to say that the folks who attend your eco-restoration camps all over the world are immersed in learning and doing precisely what you've just described. Maybe you can take a minute or two and talk about how those camps work.
Yeah, essentially what's happening is this is the 29th COP. And the COP is talking about theoretical responses and financial responses, which are basically connected to power and money. And here in the camps, we have people who are understanding that their children's future, their grandchildren's future, and future generations of all life depend on what happens with Earth systems. And these life support systems, we know how to restore. And if we restore them, then we know that it can assist in lowering surface temperatures. It can assist in infiltrating and retaining and maintaining the hydrology near the Earth. And so we're talking about these disasters of floods or wildfires. Well, we know what causes them. Are we willing to take the intellectual leap and the political will to actually act on these things? So this is what is an adaptation. And ecosystem-based adaptation, it works. We know this. I've seen areas the size of the Netherlands restored from desert-like conditions to fully functional ecosystems within 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Remarkable stories that you have, and the resiliency of nature with I guess, is it fair to say, a little helping hand from humanity to sort of get out of the way and or provide the missing nutrients. It reminds me of some of you may be aware of the movement called biomimicry, and also in my book I wrote a bit about that. And I just wanted to quote one section from the originator of biomimicry, Janine Benyus. She described what she calls the mega patterns that characterize all life and can be a guide to what she calls climate affirming design. And then she says, these patterns act as a kind of code of conduct for living here on Earth. All life is locally attuned and adapted, is diverse and resilient, builds from the bottom up, is nested and modular, leverages interdependence, and relies on information and cooperation. It performs chemistry in water at ambient temperatures and pressure. It runs on sunlight. It shops locally. It optimizes rather than maximizes. It creates with mistakes and processes and cycles, endlessly reconfiguring a safe subset of the elements in the periodic table. I've rarely read a more eloquent description of nature and the kinds of principles that we ought to be aspiring to. Paul, do you want to add anything to what we've talked about?
Well, one of the things that to keep in mind is that the rate of climate change is accelerating faster and faster, and because greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are still rising in fact, at faster rates, curves are bending upwards instead of downwards. And there's also tipping points in the climate system. So, it becomes very difficult for adaptation when you've got a very fast moving change in the system. We tend to try to divide things up into, say, adaptation and mitigation, but often many of the mitigation techniques are actually also, a way of adapting or allowing adaptation to occur. And we talk mostly about adaptation for humans, but the biosphere is rapidly adjusting or adapting to the conditions. For example, many species there's a habitable zone of temperatures and humidities and conditions where species thrive, and when the climate changes very quickly, where these species are living is no longer the ideal situation for them. So we're getting massive migrations of species towards the poles, towards colder areas, or in mountain regions, or we're getting movements up the mountains. For example, I discussed some farming of nutmeg in Grenada, and one of the ways that they're adapting to the increasing temperatures is they're having to grow the nutmeg on further and further up in the mountainous regions of the mountains of that country, the volcanic mountains. And in order, eventually you run out of space, right? When the temperature changes too much, then you reach the top and you can't. You're out of luck. So, there's many things that people are doing, but it's very important that we use as much mitigation as we can, and that includes things like carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management to buy us time to slash emissions and to slow down the whole situation of the whole rates of change of the climate system, so that we can give many different biosphere species, both plants and animals, a fighting chance to survive, because things are just changing too fast.
Well, I think that's what's becomes more and more evident, that it's the rate of change that is unprecedented in today's world as compared to the past, and therefore, again, adaptation is a kind of constant need, if you will. I just wanted to set a little more context for this conversation. We're here on Thursday, the day before the official ending of COP. I guess it gets extended as the negotiations go into the middle of the night and the next day. And at a panel I was at earlier today, they talked about the fact that since the one sentence in the 2015 agreement, Paris Agreement, there was then in Glasgow, there was the development and adoption of something called a framework for global climate resilience, and they identified 7 areas to focus on. You won't be surprised to hear what they are: water, food, health, nature and biodiversity, infrastructure and human settlements, poverty and cultural heritage. And what was emphasized was that the discussions that are going on right now, probably just a few hundred yards or meters from where we are trying to come up with a financing scheme that in part could help support adaptation in each of these 7 critical areas. And so as we sit here on the sidelines, just literally a few hundred meters away, critically important discussions are occurring. John, I wanted to ask you, when you leave this COP, what would success look like? When you went home, if you had the kind of smile I just saw on your face, describe what would have happened, would happen by tomorrow or whenever.
Well, I'm afraid at 72, I'm a little too experienced. I'm not expecting much from the COP, but I'm going to be satisfied if hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people understand that each person has the ability to change the relationship between biology and physics on the planet. What I've seen is that it's possible to really realize that I've seen surface temperature differentials of 45 degrees centigrade because artificially replaced vegetation has changed the direct solar radiation. And when you understand that over evolutionary time, billions of years, long before there were human beings, the plants started with nothing. They started with totally different gases in the atmosphere. They started with totally different soils that were geologic in nature, and they covered the entire planet with biological life. And biology, self-organized, self-replicated, living and dying by generations, and they altered the physics, which lowered the surface temperatures, which held the moisture, and which filtered the water and continuously renewed the systems. And the biodiversity was constantly differentiating and speciating, leading to human beings and other climax species. And basically, in just a few thousand and tens of thousands of years, human beings have messed up this very long situation. And when we talk about biomimicry, so success for me is to understand what's happened and to focus our energy, because we are clever, we are effective when we work together and when we do the right things. And if we restore the ecological systems on the planet, it will re-regulate the climate. If we don't, if we keep considering that materialism is the basis of our lives and that domination and inequality is possible and acceptable, then I think we're going to have to face the consequences of the mistakes we've made. So success to me is learning what this is and doing something about it.
Well, thank you. That was very eloquent and extremely important. If we could take that those 90 seconds or so and send that around to everyone, there might be would be a huge difference. No, I'm wondering, going back to sort of institutions, we have if I'm not mistaken, essentially a biodiversity COP that occurred not all that long ago, and a climate COP. Paul, does it make sense to have these two COPs that are in separate continents and deal with issues that are so interrelated?
Yeah, they called it COP15 for the biodiversity conference in Montreal this last year, and I guess it was a lot of the same people, but there were people that attended one and not that have never been to one of these COPs. So I guess it's I mean, we really need to look at how the UN structures things, because there's way too many people that come to these climate conferences, and it's why have 2 weeks of a conference when most of the decisions are made on the second last day and the very last day? You could just have the 2-day conference and come up with the decisions, but we have to be, a few more points on adaptation. We have to recognize that some places just can't adapt. Like if your house is built on a river floodplain, and we know that there's extreme weather events, your house just shouldn't be on that floodplain. So the best adaptation would be to move elsewhere, and that land shouldn't be used for building. And if you're on coastal areas, of course, we know sea level is going to accelerate with present emission trajectories and stuff. So it doesn't make sense to have all this new infrastructure, new people moving to these regions. So we have to understand and be practical and say, you cannot adapt to all aspects of climate change. And yeah, again, it comes back to the rate of change, and how does you can also talk about adaptation to when say non climate change understanding political parties get into power. Like, how does a country adapt when their leader is almost a climate denier? Well, then you need the states to step up, and you need the cities to step up, and they need to basically adapt to the federal government being in charge. Not to mention any names, right? So there's all different aspects of things. I mean, basically, adaptation is trying to, live in a region that sort of gives you a comfortable sort of way of life and safety, and we have insurance for our houses and buildings and cars and things. But insurance companies, if we lose insurance companies because they all go bankrupt, then that's a maladaptation, if you like. And it's going to send many people into poverty. So there's all of these different. It's not just adapting to climate change; it's adapting to what happens to governments and different companies that give us safety.
Thanks, Paul. Are there any questions from the audience before we wrap up today? I don't see any right now. So I just, I was reminded as you were speaking, John, of when I was a graduate student a long time ago. One of the seminal books that I read as an urban planning student was a book called Design with Nature, and this was a revolutionary book. It was by a Scots, Ian McHarg, and the fact that it was revolutionary essentially told the same story you're telling. That we had to actually somebody write a book and say, no, when you design cities and settlements and so forth, nature needs to be preeminent and have a seat at the table, if that's the right way to put it. I think if I may be oversimplifying your message, Sean, but I think that's a lot of what you're saying. Nature has enormous capabilities, enormous intelligence, enormous opportunity to enrich our lives and mitigate the consequences of the biodiversity and climate crisis, but it needs a hand from us. We need to, stop making it worse, stop intervening in inappropriate ways, and to use the kinds of approaches that you're using in your camps, that you're demonstrating in your films and so forth, to basically show that there's a better way, a different way. And I want to end on that. I hope those who are watching will take this message to heart. There's very few messages more important than what we've talked about today. Get involved, work with nature. Let's have a better world, and we thank you very much.